They told me the words no child should ever hear. We wish you were never born on the night I wore my graduation gown. I didn't scream or cry, I simply counted the way I always did. The tuition transfers, the rent checks, the hospital bills I covered while they praised my sister's white coat. That night, I chose something unthinkable. I walked away, no begging for love, no bargaining for worth, just silence, boundaries, and a future written with my own signature. This is not revenge that shouts. It is revenge that rebuilds, breathes free, and finally learns to belong. The restaurant glowed with soft amber light, every table draped in white linen and polished silverware that caught the glow of chandeliers overhead. It was the kind of night I had dreamed of for years, a celebration not only of a degree, but of survival, of endless nights, studying and working, of proving that discipline could overcome doubt. My colleagues filled the room with laughter, glasses clinking, their voices carrying the warmth of admiration. I kept repeating to myself, almost like a mantra, "Tonight will be different. Tonight they will finally see me." My thesis advisor, Professor Alvarez, raised a glass and spoke about my relentless work ethic. His words painted me as more than a student, as someone with the grit and vision to make an impact far beyond the classroom. A ripple of applause moved through the room. I bowed my head politely, feeling heat creep into my cheeks. This was the moment I hoped my parents would lean forward, smile, and finally beam with pride. Instead, I saw their polite nods, stiff and hollow. My mother's gaze slid across the table as if she were already preparing her next line, one that would have little to do with me. Moments later, Daniel Reed, my manager at work, took the floor. He described late nights in the office when I had saved projects from collapse, my ability to carry a team even when the pressure crushed everyone else. My colleagues whistled and clapped, some calling out my name. I smiled, forcing myself to believe this was the point when my parents would finally soften. But as the cheers settled, I caught the quick exchange between them, my father leaning closer to a guest and muttering something that made my mother laugh. The sound wasn't joy, it was dismissal. Then the pivot came, subtle but sharp. A guest near my parents, impressed by the speeches, asked, "You must be so proud of Mara. Stanford isn't an easy achievement." The question hung in the air like a fragile glass waiting to shatter. My chest tightened, bracing for the answer I had craved my whole life. My father's lips curled into a faint smirk. "She's smart, yes," he said, "but our younger daughter, Brooke, she's the real pride of the family. She's saving lives every day. That's what matters." My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes lighting up for the first time that evening. The air at the table shifted. Conversations faltered, forks paused mid-air. I felt my face flush, every eye drawn toward me. The applause, the admiration, all of it twisted into a spotlight of pity. I swallowed hard, lifting my glass as though to join the toast, but my hand trembled. Inside, a storm gathered, silent but relentless. "Not tonight," I whispered to myself. "Please, not tonight." The silence didn't last. Another colleague, perhaps trying to rescue the awkward moment, raised his voice. "I think Mara is an inspiration. Balancing work and Stanford's MBA, that's extraordinary." The table erupted again in claps. My throat ached as I forced a smile, but once more my parents answered, not with pride, but with comparison. My father chuckled, shaking his head as if amused. "Still nothing compared to Brooke. Numbers and reports are one thing, but medicine, that's noble." The words cut through me, clean and merciless. I pressed my lips together, tasting iron. My chest burned as though every accomplishment had been stripped bare and ridiculed in front of the very people who had witnessed my climb. I thought of the nights poring over case studies with coffee gone cold, the mornings walking into the office exhausted but determined, the sacrifices stacked like bricks just to stand in this room tonight. Yet none of it mattered. To them, I was a shadow, a footnote beside Brooke's glow. Around me, I sensed the unease of others, eyes darting, whispered exchanges, the kind of discomfort people feel when a family's fractures are too raw to ignore. Still, I kept my head high, even as the weight of humiliation pressed harder. My mantra repeated, but now it sounded hollow. Tonight will be different. And with each laugh my parents shared at my expense, I realized the truth. Tonight was only a continuation of the same wound I had carried my whole life. The toast meant to honor me had become the knife that cut me open. And though I smiled, the storm inside had already begun to rise, preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The laughter at the table thinned, giving way to an uneasy silence. I tried to swallow the bitterness to keep the night from unravelling further, but then my mother leaned forward, her voice pitched high enough for everyone around to hear. "Mara works hard, yes," she said, "but what is that compared to Brooke? Anyone can sit behind a desk. It takes real courage, real brilliance to save lives." Her words rang out, not just a casual remark, but a dismissal sharpened into a blade. I felt my shoulders stiffen as the heat rushed into my face. For a heartbeat, I prayed it would stop there, that someone would shift the conversation, lift the weight pressing on my chest. But then my father delivered the final blow. His voice carried a sharp edge, deliberate and cold. "We wish you were never born," he said, almost casually, as though those words were nothing more than a passing joke. The table froze. I heard the clatter of a spoon dropping somewhere nearby. The air sucked from the room in one collective gasp. Time fractured. My ears rang, my vision blurred, and all I could hear was the echo of his words, ricocheting inside my skull. "Never born." A phrase so cruel it didn't even sting. It scorched, hollowing me from the inside. For years I had endured comparisons, endured silence, endured being invisible. But this was not invisibility. This was erasure. In that moment, my existence was not only diminished, but denied. I didn't scream. I didn't plead. Something inside me had already decided that silence would speak louder. Slowly, I placed my glass down. The sharp scrape of my chair against the floor split the silence like a blade. Heads turned, eyes widened, and I felt the weight of the entire room watching me. My hands trembled, but my back was straight, my chin held high. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to shrink to fit their narrative. The sound of my heels striking the floor was deliberate, echoing through the room with each step. They weren't just footsteps, they were punctuation marks, closing a chapter I had been trapped in for nearly 4 decades. Behind me, whispers rose and fell, confusion and discomfort swirling like smoke. I didn't turn back. I couldn't. If I had looked into their faces, I might have faltered, but in the corner of my vision, I caught Brooke. My sister's eyes met mine, wide and glassy, the kind of look that begged forgiveness without words. There was guilt there, undeniable, raw. She knew the truth, she always had. She knew the sacrifices, the transfers, the endless bills I had covered while she wore her white coat without worry. Yet she said nothing. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but she closed them again, sealing her silence like an accomplice. That silence, in its own way, hurt nearly as much as my father's curse. I reached the door, the hum of the restaurant fading behind me. Each step felt both heavy and liberating, as if chains were dragging but also breaking apart at the same time. Outside, the night air hit me with a chill, filling my lungs with something sharp and clean. I stood there for a moment, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red, my chest tightening and loosening in equal measure. Inside, they might have continued their dinner, perhaps pretending nothing had happened. But for me, the night was carved into permanence. That single sentence, "We wish you were never born," had severed something that could never be repaired. And though my legs trembled, though my heart ached, I knew I had done something I had never dared before. I had walked away. The echo of my footsteps lingered long after, like the drumbeat of a new beginning, one that would no longer be written by them. The apartment was silent when I returned, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing against your skin, reminding you of everything you left behind. I slipped off my heels and let them fall against the hardwood floor. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from the words still echoing in my ears. "We wish you were never born." It looped endlessly like a cruel refrain. I wanted to scream, to cry, to collapse. Instead, I moved toward the closet, to the one place where my past had been stacked and hidden for years. I pulled out a heavy cardboard box, scuffed at the corners, its weight both literal and symbolic. My ledger of truth. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened the flaps. Inside were years of my life, reduced to slips of paper and receipts. Thin as air, yet heavy enough to bend a spine. I spread them out, electricity bills, with my name scribbled across the top, tuition transfers stamped with dates from Brooks Medical School, rent checks cashed to keep my parents' house standing when layoffs hit. Each piece was proof undeniable that I had been the silent scaffolding of our family. The papers spilled across the table like a storm of white confetti, except none of it was celebratory. My hands shook as I flipped through them, each one dragging me back to a memory. There was the envelope from the first hospital bill I had covered when Dad's insurance lapsed. The wire transfer receipt for Brooks' semester abroad. The bank slip showing my account nearly emptied to cover their mortgage late fees. A decade of sacrifice laid bare in ink. I remembered the first paycheck I had ever earned. I had been so proud, fresh out of college, clutching the slip of paper like a trophy. I brought it home, hoping my parents would smile, perhaps hug me, tell me they were proud that I was standing on my own. Instead, my father barely looked at it before saying, "Good. Now send money to your sister. She needs a new set of medical textbooks." My mother had nodded, already turning the conversation to Brooks' bright future. The joy I had carried dissolved instantly, replaced with an obligation that never seemed to end. That pattern repeated endlessly. Every milestone of mine became an errand for Brooks' benefit. Every late night I worked a second job wasn't seen as determination, but as expectation. I had convinced myself it was love, that this was what being a daughter meant. But now, looking at the paper mountain on my kitchen table, I saw it for what it truly was. A ledger of debts never acknowledged, of sacrifices never spoken aloud. I traced my fingers over the faded ink of an old transfer slip, the numbers barely visible now. I had kept every one of them, maybe as a secret hope that someday, when my parents finally asked why I looked so tired, I could hand them this box and say, "Here, this is me, this is what I've done for you." But that day never came. Instead, they had erased me in front of a room full of people. Tears blurred my vision, dripping onto the papers, smudging ink that had already begun to fade with time. My chest ached with a mix of anger and grief, but beneath it all was clarity. This was the evidence of my life, the undeniable truth of who I had been to them. Not a daughter to be loved, but a ledger to be balanced, a wallet to be opened, a shadow to be ignored. I gathered the papers into piles, my movements slow, deliberate. The box no longer felt like a secret cache. It felt like a weapon. Not one I intended to wield out of spite, but one I would carry as proof if ever the lies resurfaced. Proof that I had mattered, even if only on paper. Proof that their dismissal of me was not rooted in truth, but in willful blindness. As I closed the box and slid it back across the table, a thought crystallized in my mind, sharp and cold. I had given them a decade of my life, and they had given me erasure in return. The papers still lay scattered across the table when dawn began to lighten the edges of the blinds. I had not slept. Instead, I worked through the night, feeding each receipt, each transfer slip, each bill into the scanner. The soft hum of the machine became a rhythm, almost meditative, as I watched digital copies form one by one. Page after page, my decade of sacrifice transformed into glowing files on the screen. When I was finished, I labelled the folder simply proof.pdf. It wasn't just a collection of documents, it was armour, a shield against denial, a defence against erasure. I sat back and stared at the file, the cursor blinking beside its name like a heartbeat. The thought came uninvited. If I ever needed to show the world who I really was in that family, this would be enough. Not words, not tears. Evidence, cold, indisputable evidence. For the first time, I felt a strange power humming beneath the grief. Later that week, at the office, I was staying late to finish a report when Jade, a colleague who had become one of my few confidants, wandered into the break room where I sat hunched over my laptop. She noticed the folder name on my screen before I could minimize it. "Proof? PDF?" she asked, tilting her head. I hesitated, then exhaled. Maybe I wanted someone to see. I opened the file and showed her a few pages. Electricity bills, tuition receipts, rent transfers. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the endless trail of numbers and stamps. "Mara," she whispered, her voice heavy, "you've been their silent parent, not their child." The words sliced through me, cleaner than my father's curse, sharper than my mother's dismissals. A parent, not a daughter. That was what I had been all along. I felt the sting settle deep in my chest, yet there was also relief in hearing it named out loud. Jade didn't pity me. She looked at me with something closer to respect, even awe. But that sentence would echo in my mind for weeks to come. I closed the file and shut the laptop, my hands trembling slightly. "One day," I murmured, "maybe I'll show them. Maybe I'll show everyone." Jade squeezed my shoulder, saying nothing more, and left me with silence that felt less lonely than usual. From that night forward, something shifted in me. Instead of pouring energy into waiting for my parents' recognition, I channeled it into work. The company was gearing up for a major consulting project with international stakes, and I volunteered for tasks others shied away from. Each late night became less about obligation and more about reclaiming myself. Each successful presentation was another brick laid in the foundation of a life that was mine alone. The ledger box, now neatly packed again, sat in the corner of my apartment. I no longer saw it as a wound hidden away, but as a record, a chronicle of truth I could wield if needed. I locked it, slid it under my bed, and whispered to myself, not today, but someday. If they ever try to deny me again, the proof will speak louder than they ever allowed me to. That night, as I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion pressed heavy on my limbs. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel powerless. I had my armour, I had my voice, even if it was still silent. And I had the certainty that my story wasn't theirs to erase anymore. The office lights glowed against the skyline long after most of San Francisco had gone to sleep. It was nearly 2 a.m, yet my desk was alive with scattered reports, glowing monitors, and empty coffee cups stacked like monuments to endurance. This was the rhythm of my new life. Late nights filled not with tears or quiet sacrifices for others, but with purpose that was mine alone. I was no longer a shadow funding someone else's dream. I was building my own. The project on my shoulders was the company's largest yet. A multi-million-dollar consulting deal that could make or break our reputation with an international client. Teams rotated in and out, but I stayed anchored, leading strategy meetings, breaking down complex problems, and pushing solutions forward with relentless precision. My colleagues looked to me as the compass, and for once I felt the weight as empowering rather than draining. There were nights when I caught my reflection in the dark window, the city lights flickering behind me. My eyes looked tired, but my posture was upright, steady. I had grown accustomed to exhaustion, but now it was different. This exhaustion carried meaning. I wasn't pouring myself into a void anymore. The recognition came faster than I expected. Trade journals wrote about the project, mentioning my name as a rising strategist in the industry. Emails poured in from professional circles praising the work, asking for collaborations, even offering opportunities abroad. Colleagues began to treat me differently, less as the quiet workhorse, more as a leader. In meetings, my voice wasn't just heard, it carried weight. On the surface, I was thriving. I bought myself small luxuries I had once denied: a tailored blazer, a weekend at a quiet coastal retreat, a new set of bookshelves for the apartment I could finally decorate without guilt. These tokens felt like proof that I was no longer tethered to the endless obligations of my past. And yet, every success carried a shadow. When my name appeared in print, when applause filled the room after a presentation, I felt the warmth, but it never reached the cold place inside me. Each triumph was accompanied by an echo, an empty seat in the invisible audience I still longed to please. I told myself I didn't need it anymore, that their approval was meaningless. But late at night, when the office was silent except for the hum of computers, I would close my eyes and imagine what it might feel like to hear just once, "We're proud of you, Mara." Those 4 words haunted me more than my father's curse. Because while the curse had cut me down, the absence of pride left me hollow. I tried to fill that hollowness with work, with milestones stacked higher and higher, as if the sheer volume of achievement could drown out the silence left behind. The higher I climbed, the clearer it became. Success was not a balm, it was a mirror reflecting the void more sharply with each new accomplishment. At team dinners, when colleagues toasted to my leadership, I smiled and raised my glass, but the sound was muted in my ears. At conferences, when strangers introduced themselves with admiration, I shook their hands, but part of me wondered why the one handshake I had craved my whole life was the only one I could never receive. The paradox weighed heavily. Outwardly, I was unstoppable. Inwardly, I was still that daughter erased at her own graduation dinner. My father's words lingered like ash, my mother's comparisons etched like scars. Every headline, every handshake, every piece of applause only highlighted the cruel irony. The world was proud of me, everyone but the 2 people I had once needed most. The apartment overlooked the bay. its windows stretching wide enough to catch the sweep of the water glimmering beneath the afternoon sun. It wasn't a mansion, not even close, but it was mine. A space bought entirely with my own hands, every square foot a quiet declaration of independence. And when I turned the key for the first time, the sound echoed inside like a victory anthem. I cried that day, not out of sadness, but because I finally held something no one could diminish or dismiss. To mark the moment, I decided to invite the people who had become my chosen family. Colleagues who had shared late nights in the office, friends from Stanford who had seen me stumble and rise again, and Professor Alvarez, whose faith in me had never wavered even when my parents did. The apartment filled with the hum of voices, the clink of glasses, and the smell of food we carried in on mismatched trays. We sat on the floor, plates balanced on our knees, laughter bouncing against the bare walls. There was no competition, no comparison, no invisible scale weighing me against someone else. Only warmth, only recognition. I looked around at the faces glowing in the lamplight, and for the first time in years, I felt what family was supposed to mean. Professor Alvarez raised his glass. "Tamara," he said, smiling at me, "for proving that persistence builds not only careers but character." Applause followed, genuine and full. My chest tightened with gratitude. Here, in this room, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the wallet. I was simply myself, and that was enough. But joy is fragile, and sometimes it takes only one careless question to crack it wide open. Toward the end of the evening, as people gathered near the balcony to admire the view of the bay, a guest I barely knew, a friend of a friend, turned to me with a polite smile. "Your parents must be so proud," she said. "Are they here tonight?" The words landed like glass, shattering across the floor. The laughter dimmed in my ears, replaced by a hollow ringing. My chest constricted, and for a split second I felt exposed, like someone had ripped the bandage off a wound I'd been trying to hide. The room was still buzzing with chatter, but in my mind everything went quiet. I forced a smile, my voice steady, but thin. "My family couldn't make it." The guest nodded, oblivious to the weight her question carried, and turned back to the conversation. The moment passed quickly for everyone else, but not for me. Inside, the words twisted like a knife. Couldn't make it. The truth was harsher. They had chosen not to be there, chosen never to stand in rooms like this with me. They had erased me long before this celebration. I laughed when others laughed, poured wine into glasses, posed for photos with friends. On the outside, I was radiant, a woman whose career was rising, whose new home buzzed with life. But inside, another fracture deepened. Every cheer and every toast reminded me not only of how far I had come, but also of the absence that still ached like phantom pain. When the last guest left and the apartment grew quiet again, I stood on the balcony, the wind from the bay brushing against my face. The city lights stretched across the horizon, twinkling like they belonged to me. Yet even in the glow of success, I felt the echo of that question gnawing at me. "Are they here tonight?" I whispered the answer into the night, my voice almost carried away by the wind. No. They never were, and maybe they never will be. The pounding on my door came just after dusk. 3 sharp knocks followed by a pause, then 3 more, as if the person on the other side were determined to break through with persistence alone. I froze in the middle of my living room, a half-read report balanced on my lap. No one knocked on my door that way. My friends texted first, colleagues called ahead. My chest tightened with a sense of foreboding, a shadow of familiarity that I had hoped never to feel again. When I opened the door, my parents stood there, framed by the fading evening light. My mother's handbag was clutched tightly against her chest, her lips pressed into a line that looked less like sorrow and more like strategy. My father didn't wait for me to invite them in. He stepped across the threshold with the ease of someone who still believed he owned the space I lived in. My mother followed, glancing around with faint disapproval, as though even my success wasn't quite enough to impress her. I shut the door slowly, my fingers gripping the handle longer than necessary, steadying myself. "What are you doing here?" My voice was quiet, but the steel beneath it surprised even me. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. My mother sighed dramatically, settling onto the sofa as though it were hers. "Mara, the family is in trouble. Brooke's residency has been interrupted. The hospital is cutting staff, and she's been suspended temporarily. She needs money to hold her place in the specialty program. Without it, she risks losing everything she's worked for." My father added quickly, "You're her sister. It's your duty to step in." The words hit me with a chilling familiarity. Duty? Obligation? As though those were synonyms for love. I stood rooted, listening as they laid out Brooke's predicament, painting it as a family emergency that only I could resolve. Images flashed in my mind, the tuition transfers that had kept Brooke in school, the nights I worked late so she wouldn't have to, the hospital bills I'd covered without thanks. I thought of the years when helping Brooke was the refrain of my life, when every dollar I earned was redirected to fuel her path while mine was dimmed. And yet here they were again, expecting the same sacrifice, as though nothing had changed, as though I hadn't walked away from them entirely on the night of my graduation. I forced myself to sit, folding my hands together so they wouldn't tremble. "And why," I asked slowly, "would you come here after everything that happened, after what you said to me?" My mother waved her hand dismissively. "We were angry. Words don't matter in moments like that. What matters is family. And family means stepping up when you're needed." Her casual dismissal of the wound they had carved into me made my stomach turn. They hadn't come to apologize. They hadn't come to acknowledge the pain or to undo the curse they had thrown at me. They had come because they wanted something. I looked at my father, waiting to see if he would add anything different, something softer. Instead, he doubled down, his voice firm, almost commanding. "You've always had money. You've always been good at this business world of yours. That's why you should help. Brooke's the future of this family. She's the one carrying the name forward. And you, well, this is just what you're meant to do." My jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The rage and sorrow twisted together inside me until I could barely tell them apart. They still didn't see me, not as a daughter, not as a human being. To them, I was a resource, a bank account, a duty. I rose to my feet, the air between us heavy with years of unspoken truth. "So you're not here because you regret anything. You're not here because you love me. You're here because Brooke needs money, and I'm supposed to hand it over without question. Is that right?" Neither of them answered. Their silence was confirmation enough. I steadied my breath and forced my voice into calm, measured tones. "I won't give you money," I said, each word deliberate, "but I can help in other ways. I know mentors in the medical field. I can connect Brooke with grants and scholarship programs. There are hospitals offering bridge fellowships that could keep her career intact without draining me dry." My mother's expression hardened, the polite mask slipping to reveal irritation. "That's not what she needs," she snapped. "She needs cash now. Contacts and papers don't keep her in the program." My father leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Money is the only thing that counts. Everything else is just talk. Their certainty, their complete dismissal of my attempt to help without surrendering myself, struck me harder than a slap. For years, I had been their safety net, the one they turned to whenever the walls closed in. And still, even after I had cut ties, they assumed I would return to that role with no boundaries, no conditions. I shook my head. No, I said firmly. I won't do it. Not again. If Brooke needs help, she can take advantage of the connections I'm offering. That's all I'll give. My father's jaw tightened, his silence vibrating with anger. Then he rose suddenly, brushing past me toward the door without another word. My mother followed reluctantly, throwing me a glare sharp enough to pierce. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a brief moment I thought that was the end of it. But a week later, I received a call from my bank. A loan application had been flagged for irregularities. Confused, I asked for details, and my blood froze as the representative explained. A high-interest loan had been signed under my name, complete with my social security number, employment details, and even my current address. The signature at the bottom of the form wasn't mine, but I knew instantly whose it was, my father. A mix of fury and betrayal surged through me so violently I had to grip the desk to steady myself, to steal my identity, to sign my name without consent. It wasn't desperation alone, it was entitlement. The belief that my life, my credit, my future still belonged to them, no matter what I'd said. I spent the next 48 hours unravelling the mess. Calls to the bank, fraud reports filed, passwords reset, every linked account locked down, every automatic transfer cancelled. I even placed alerts with the credit bureaus. A paper fortress around my name. It was exhausting, infuriating work. But when it was done, I felt a strange sense of clarity. They could no longer reach me. That night I stood at my door and looked around my apartment. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet I had earned. My parents had crossed the last line, turned themselves into strangers who carried my last name, but none of my trust. I walked to the door, pressed my palm against the wood, and whispered into the silence, "You will never enter here again." Then, with a final twist of the lock, I closed them out, not just from my apartment, but from the life they had once controlled. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was louder than their knock had ever been. A declaration that the family I had once known no longer existed. In that moment, I realized the truth. They hadn't come to me for love, and they never would. They had come for money, and when they couldn't take it freely, they tried to steal it. The door between us wasn't just wood and steel. It was the line between daughter and stranger. And with that line drawn, I finally understood. They were no longer my family. The days after the loan incident blurred together in a haze of anger and exhaustion. I buried myself in work, sealing every financial crack my parents had tried to exploit. But the wound ran deeper than fraud alerts and locked accounts. It wasn't just about money, it was about being reduced to a commodity, stripped of dignity, treated as nothing but a resource. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than ever, pressing in on me like a verdict. No matter how far I climbed, the echoes of erasure would follow. One evening, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and stared at a blank post on LinkedIn. My fingers hovered over the keys. I hadn't planned to share anything personal on a professional platform. My profile was filled with strategy updates, industry news, and the occasional leadership article. But that night, something inside me snapped. If I couldn't speak to them, maybe I could speak to the world. I began to type, I didn't use names. I didn't accuse directly. Instead, I wrote about a daughter who had been invisible, who had covered bills and tuition for years, only to be told she was worthless. I wrote about what it meant to be treated as a wallet instead of a person, about the weight of comparison that never lifted. I admitted the pain of hearing words no child should hear, and the strange strength that came from walking away. The words poured out faster than I expected. By the time I stopped, the post stretched longer than anything I had ever shared before. I read it twice, hesitated, then hit publish. I told myself it wouldn't matter, that maybe a handful of people might see it, perhaps nod quietly, then scroll on. But by morning, my phone was buzzing non-stop. Notifications stacked one after another, hundreds, then thousands. My post had exploded. Within 24 hours, it had been shared across networks far beyond my own. People I had never met commented with stories that mirrored mine. Sons overlooked for their siblings, daughters dismissed because they chose careers outside the noble path, children who had never once heard the words, "I'm proud of you." Messages filled my inbox, some long confessions, others simple notes of gratitude. One woman wrote, "Your words made me cry. I thought I was the only one who felt invisible in my family. Thank you for saying what I never could." A man confessed, "I've carried my parents financially for years, but they still introduce me as their lazy son because I'm not a doctor. Reading your post gave me the courage to finally set boundaries." Message after message, story after story, I realized the truth. I wasn't alone. My private shame, the wound I thought belonged only to me, was shared by countless others scattered across the world. The impact spread beyond the personal. Industry leaders began resharing the post, calling it a testament to resilience and leadership. A CEO wrote, "This is why empathy matters in business. If someone can survive this and thrive, they can lead through anything." My own company noticed too. Instead of frowning on my vulnerability, HR reached out to commend me for using my voice. For the first time, my pain was not just tolerated, it was valued. Sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through the avalanche of responses, I felt something shift inside me. The hollowness that success had never managed to fill was being patched. Not by my parents' words, but by strangers who understood. They weren't bound to me by blood, but by shared scars, by recognition of pain that had long gone unnamed. For the first time in my life, I felt less like an outcast and more like a member of a hidden community, a family of the unseen. The momentum from that single LinkedIn post carried further than I could have imagined. Within weeks, I received an email with the subject line, "Invitation to Keynote." At first, I thought it was spam, another empty pitch, but when I opened it, my breath caught. A leadership conference in San Francisco, one that drew executives, innovators, and scholars from around the world, was asking me to share my story. I read the message 3 times. They wanted me to speak not about consulting strategies, but about resilience, about finding strength in the face of dismissal, about leading even when your own foundation is fractured. For years, I had believed my story was one of shame. Now others were calling it a source of wisdom. The weeks leading up to the event were a blur of rehearsals and restless nights. Standing on that stage, under the harsh brightness of spotlights, I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on me. My voice shook at first, but then the words found their rhythm. I told them about the years of sacrifice, the endless bills, the comparisons that gnawed at me. I told them about the night of my graduation dinner, the curse that erased me and the silence that rebuilt me. When I finished, the hall erupted in applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was thunderous, sustained, the kind that rattles your bones. I stood there, tears pricking my eyes, and realised that I had turned pain into power. That night, back in my apartment, still trembling from the adrenaline of the stage, I opened my inbox. Among the flood of congratulations and invitations was one message that stopped me cold. The sender, Brooke. The subject line was simple: "I'm sorry." My hands shook as I clicked it open. "Mara," it began. "I don't know if you'll read this, but I have to say it anyway. I always knew. I knew about the tuition transfers, the bills you covered, the sacrifices you made. I saw the receipts you sent to the school. I kept copies of some of them. I should have said something. I should have defended you. But I stayed silent, and I let them make you the villain while I became the hero. I can't undo that, but I need you to know I never believed their words. I always knew who really held us up." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. Each line hit like a confession carved too late, yet desperately needed. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't making excuses. It was simply an apology, raw and unadorned. "I'm sorry," she wrote again, the words standing alone at the end of the message. The tears came then, hot and uncontrollable. I pressed my hand against my mouth, the sobs shaking free from a place I had buried for years. I cried for the girl who had been erased, for the woman who had built walls of steel, and for the sister who had finally spoken, though far too late. It was a strange mixture, rage and relief, grief and release. I was furious at her silence all those years, at her complicity in my erasure, but I was also lighter, knowing that someone in that family had finally acknowledged the truth. Brooke had not defended me when it mattered most, but she had broken the silence now. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, my body trembling with exhaustion. My tears slowed, leaving behind a fragile calm. For the first time, I let myself believe that perhaps I wasn't entirely invisible in that house. Perhaps, even if too late, my sacrifices had not gone unseen. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a crack in the wall I had built so high around my heart. And through that crack, light, however faint, began to seep in. The crisis began with a single email, its subject line flashing urgent in bold red, contract at risk. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The billion-dollar project I had poured months into, our crown jewel, the deal that would cement both my team's reputation and my own, was unravelling. A critical supplier overseas had failed to deliver on time. Without immediate intervention, the entire agreement could collapse, costing the client millions and us something far more permanent: credibility. For the next 72 hours, my life compressed into frantic calls, midnight negotiations, and endless spreadsheets. My apartment became a war room, walls plastered with charts, my laptop a lifeline. I barely ate, barely slept. Coffee and adrenaline kept me moving, each passing hour a reminder of how thin the line between triumph and ruin truly was. I could almost hear the whispers already forming in the industry. She couldn't handle it. She cracked under pressure. The weight pressed hard, but I refused to bend. This was my battlefield, and I would not lose. And then, just as the corporate storm reached its peak, the personal one returned with equal force. A letter arrived from the bank addressed to my parents, but forwarded to me through a relative. It was stark, cold, and merciless. Their mortgage was in arrears, foreclosure proceedings imminent. If payments weren't made within 30 days, they would lose the house. Within hours, my phone began buzzing with calls from cousins, aunts, even distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Their voices carried rehearsed urgency, weaving guilt into every syllable. They're your parents, Mara. You can't let them end up on the street. Think of Brooke. Think of the family's name. I gripped the phone tighter with each call, fury rising like bile. Where were these voices when I was silently carrying the family for over a decade? Where were they when I scraped together tuition money while living off instant noodles? Now they emerged, not to comfort, not to acknowledge, but to pressure. To twist the knife deeper into a wound that had never healed. My apartment felt smaller with every ring, every voicemail demanding sacrifice. I stood at the window overlooking the bay, the water dark and restless beneath the city lights. The same question pulsed in my mind, over and over. How much more must I give? Sleep was impossible. My days were already consumed with saving the project, conference calls bleeding into dawn, negotiations balanced on the edge of collapse. At night, my phone lit up with demands that I return to the role I had finally cast off, the provider, the rescuer, the invisible backbone. The dual storms collided, leaving me breathless. On the third night, as I sat hunched over my laptop, exhaustion pressing into my bones, I realised I was trembling. Not from caffeine, not from lack of sleep, but from the sheer weight of being pulled in two directions. On one side, a professional crisis that could define my career. On the other, a family crisis designed to pull me back into chains I had fought to escape. The parallels were cruelly ironic. Both situations teetered on the brink of collapse. Both demanded signatures, contracts that would bind futures. One contract written in corporate ink, the other in bloodlines that refused to let me go. For the first time in months, doubt crept in. Was I heartless for ignoring the pleas, for turning my back when foreclosure loomed? Was I selfish for focusing on the project instead of the house that had once been my home? The guilt pressed hard, even as I reminded myself of the truth. That home had never sheltered me, not really. It had been walls where silence cut deeper than words, where my existence was dismissed with laughter and curses. Still, the weight of family is not easily shrugged off. Their voices haunted me as I typed contracts and brokered deals. Every keystroke was accompanied by echoes of obligation. Every chart of losses and gains blurred with the image of that house crumbling, not just brick and mortar, but the illusion of belonging I had chased for too long. The 72 hours stretched endlessly, a crucible that tested not just my professional resolve, but my very identity. When dawn finally broke after the third day, my body sagged against the chair. The project was not yet saved, but the plan was in motion, threads pulled taut across continents. My team believed in me, the client still held faith, but my phone continued to vibrate, relentless with messages that had nothing to do with contracts or strategy. Mara, save the family. You're the only one who can fix this. And in the depths of that exhaustion, I felt myself falling. Free falling into a void of impossible choices. My career on one side, my blood on the other. Both demanding, both fragile, both ready to collapse. The messages from relatives grew sharper, more desperate, until I finally silenced my phone altogether. But silence didn't stop the storm. It only drove it to my doorstep. One evening, as I returned from yet another round of tense negotiations with the client, I found my parents waiting outside my apartment building. Their faces were pale, drawn tight with fatigue, but their eyes carried the same expectation I had seen all my life, that I would give and they would take. Inside, the air grew heavy the moment we sat down. My mother clutched her handbag as if it were a shield, my father staring at me with a brittle mix of anger and need. "We'll lose the house," he said flatly. "We've run out of options. You have to step in." I folded my hands on the table and spoke carefully, my voice even. "I'll help, but not the way you want. I will use my connections. I can speak to lenders, I can find grant programs, I can connect Brooke to fellowships that will stabilise her career. But I won't hand over money, not anymore." Their faces darkened instantly. My mother shook her head. "That won't do. This is urgent. We don't need introductions. We need cash." I took a deep breath. "Then here are my conditions. If you want any help from me, you will sign an agreement. A contract. It will state 3 things. 1, that you will never again humiliate or insult me. 2, that you will stop comparing me to Brooke. And 3, that you will never contact me again for money. If you want my assistance, those are the terms." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My father's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening on the armrest. "You would treat your parents like business partners?" he spat. "No," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "I'm treating you like people who broke trust. And trust can only be rebuilt with boundaries." For the first time, Brooke spoke. She had been quiet until then, her eyes darting between us. Now she reached for the pen I had laid on the table and signed the paper without hesitation. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "Mara, I know you've carried more than anyone ever admitted. I should have said it sooner." Her voice cracked, and for a moment I saw not the favoured child, but a woman exhausted by the weight of being pedestalised. My heart twisted, but I stayed focused. My parents stared at the paper as though it were poison. Minutes dragged. Finally, desperation cracked through pride. My mother snatched the pen, her hand trembling as she scrawled her name. My father hesitated longer, but the reality of foreclosure loomed larger than his pride. At last, with a bitter glare, he signed. The contract lay on the table, 3 signatures gleaming in ink. That same night, across town, another contract awaited me, the revised agreement with our client. My team had pulled off the impossible, securing a new supplier, renegotiating terms, and salvaging the billion-dollar deal. All it needed now was my signature. I sat alone in my office, the city lights glowing beyond the glass, both documents before me. One was written on letterhead, binding a corporation to its commitments. The other was scribbled on plain paper, binding blood to boundaries. I picked up the pen, my hand steady despite the exhaustion coursing through me, and signed them both. 2 signatures, one for my career, one for my freedom. As the ink dried, I felt a weight lift from my chest, replaced by something sturdier than relief. Resolve. My future was no longer theirs to dictate. My worth was no longer negotiable. For the first time, the contracts of my life were written not by obligation, but by choice. The apartment glowed warmly with the soft gold of string lights draped across the balcony. The bay shimmered outside my windows, reflecting the laughter and voices filling the space within. It was a small gathering, intimate, intentional. My closest colleagues, the friends who had carried me through sleepless nights of study, and Professor Alvarez, whose faith in me had once been the single thread that kept me from unravelling. Tonight, for the first time, I wasn't celebrating a project or an award. I was celebrating a life I had built on my own terms. Plates of food sat scattered across the table, wine glasses clinked, and the room buzzed with warmth. We weren't dressed in gowns or suits. No one here needed grandeur to prove anything. This was not about prestige, it was about belonging. Every smile I saw was genuine, every toast free of comparison. These were people who had chosen to be here, people who had chosen me. Brooke arrived quietly, slipping in after the others, her eyes searching for mine. For a moment, the room fell away as I watched her cross the threshold. She looked different, tired perhaps, but softer, her posture carrying less of the unshakable confidence she once wore. When she hugged me, it wasn't perfunctory, it was tentative, as though she feared I might not accept it. Throughout the evening, she stayed close but silent, helping refill drinks, laughing at stories, but never quite letting her gaze leave me. I wondered if she was waiting for the right moment, or if she feared there wouldn't be one. Near the end of the night, when most guests had drifted toward the balcony to watch the city lights ripple across the bay, Brooke approached me. In her hands was a package wrapped in simple brown paper, tied with string. She held it out wordlessly, her fingers trembling slightly. I took it, unwrapping it slowly. Inside was a thick, bound volume, heavier than I expected. On the cover, in neat black letters, were the words, "Receipts of Love." I froze. My breath caught as I opened the first page. It was a copy of a transfer slip, the very first one I had ever sent for her tuition. Page after page followed. Electricity bills, rent checks, hospital payments. Every sacrifice I had made, carefully collected, preserved, and now bound into something that looked less like paperwork and more like testimony. At the end of the book, a handwritten note waited for me. "Sister, you built my dream. I don't deserve what you gave me, but I want you to know I never forgot. I want you to have this, not as a burden, but as proof that your love was seen, even when I was too cowardly to say it." The words blurred through my tears. I pressed the book to my chest, my body shaking with the release of years I had carried alone. This wasn't absolution. It didn't erase the silence, the complicity, or the years of comparison, but it was acknowledgement, pure, undeniable acknowledgement from the one person who had benefited most from my sacrifices. Brooke stood before me, her eyes wet, her lips trembling. "I can't change the past," she whispered, barely audible over the hum of the party. "But I can thank you now, and I can promise that I'll never let them erase you again." I didn't answer right away. Words felt too small for the flood of emotions inside me. Instead, I reached for her and pulled her into a hug. For the first time, it didn't feel like hugging a rival or a stranger painted in gold by our parents. It felt like hugging my sister. Around us, my chosen family laughed, clinked glasses, and celebrated without knowing the weight of the moment unfolding in the corner of the room. And maybe they didn't need to, because for me, that night marked something no spotlight, no headline, no applause could ever give. Recognition not from the world, but from the person whose silence had once hurt the most. For the first time, I felt seen by blood. It was a late afternoon along the bay, the kind of day when the sky turns soft grey and the wind carries the sharp scent of salt and seaweed. I had walked there to clear my mind, the receipts of love still fresh in my thoughts, the weight of Brooke's gesture resting warmly in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt a tentative peace with one piece of my past. But peace is fragile, and the world has a way of testing its edges. I spotted them before they saw me, my parents, standing near the railing where the waves slapped hard against the rocks. They looked smaller than I remembered, their posture stooped, their clothes worn. Time had carved lines into their faces, but it hadn't softened them. They still stood, with that air of entitlement, as if the world owed them acknowledgement. My stomach twisted, but I didn't turn away. When they noticed me, they didn't rush forward, they didn't cry, didn't reach out. My father gave a stiff nod. My mother clutched her coat tighter around her shoulders. For a long moment, none of us spoke, the only sound the restless water pounding the shore. Finally, my father cleared his throat. We shouldn't have said what we did that night. His voice was rough, almost reluctant. He glanced at my mother, who avoided my eyes, then muttered, "We're sorry." That was it. No grand speech, no tearful reconciliation, just two clipped words, offered too late, without flourish. The younger version of me might have begged for more, for warmth, for recognition, for a flood of affection to finally pour through the cracks. But standing there, the wind lashing against my hair, I realised I didn't need it anymore. Their apology didn't heal me, but it didn't cut me either. It was simply air. I studied their faces, the people who had once been the entire universe of my childhood. I saw pride that had withered, arrogance that had cracked, and perhaps beneath it all, a flicker of something human. Not love in the way I had needed, but maybe regret in the way they were capable of giving. "I don't forgive you," I said quietly, my voice steady. "Not completely. What you did can't be erased, but I don't hate you anymore either. I won't carry that weight." My mother flinched at the words, but my father only nodded once, as if he had expected nothing more. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't suffocating either. It was simply two sides of a broken bridge, acknowledging that the gap would never fully close. We stood there for a few more minutes, letting the wind fill the spaces where words failed. Then, without another attempt, they turned and walked away. No embraces, no promises of change. Just two figures retreating along the path, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. I watched them until they disappeared, the ache in my chest, both sharp and strangely freeing. I had always believed closure would come from their validation, from hearing the words I longed for. Instead, closure came from understanding I didn't need them to define me anymore. Their apology wasn't enough to rebuild, but it was enough to let me finally set down the burden of resentment. That night, back in my apartment, I stepped onto the balcony. The city sprawled out before me, lights twinkling against the darkening sky. The wind from the bay struck my face, cold and briny, a reminder of the elements that had always been there, indifferent yet constant. I held the keys to my home in my palm, their metal edges digging lightly into my skin. Those keys had become my symbol, proof that I owned not just walls and windows, but my freedom. Proof that I had built a life defined by choice, not obligation. I closed my fist around them, feeling their weight, grounding myself in the reality I had carved. Family could be chosen. I had chosen mine in the laughter of friends gathered around my table, in Brooke's quiet apology bound into a book, in the strangers who had written to tell me they saw themselves in my words. Worth needed no witness. It had been in me all along, waiting for me to stop searching in places that would never offer it. As the wind whipped harder, carrying the tang of salt into the night, I whispered into the open sky, a vow not of revenge, but of release. I am enough. I always was. The city lights blinked back as if in agreement, the bay below roaring like applause. And with the keys still clenched in my hand, I smiled. Not because I had finally won their pride, but because I had learned I never needed it.